over the past couple of years, I think most of us have come to understand separation in ways we never thought we would. I don't know that any of us could have imagined such a stretch of time of being distanced from each other. We've experienced that separation in so many different ways, each of us individually and collectively. It's been something that we've not been able to look away from, I don't think, because it seems to be at every turn, whether it's groups of friends or family or school or work, our various communities that intertwine, and those relationships sometimes feeling unmoored. And so we've reached for patterns of the familiar, something to hold on to, a kind of touchstone to help us either find our way or know that community is there. Those relationships are still there, and it's looked different. So as a church, we've had drive-bys and parking lots and Zoom screens and things that have left us wanting for more. And yet I've heard so many people say it's been enough, just enough to help us go from one day to the next. Reminders that we are still a community of people, reminders that we're not alone. And there is something gut-wrenching, I think, that at this time that we're beginning to move into familiar patterns once again, to be able to come together for a night like this. We look to the news and watch as people in Ukraine are experiencing a different kind of separation. Families and friends pulled apart, trying to bridge that distance. And there were images that began to emerge over the last few days of churches being the church, finding ways to gather, ways that they probably never expected they would, but recognizing that coming together however they could was a way to carry on with prayer, to carry on and say that God is present and that community still exists. I find that today I have been noticing a different feeling of the heart that I think has come from the marker of this Ash Wednesday, knowing that we've come 2 full years of those pandemic ways. And I've heard so many people say over the last week or so how much they're appreciating the human connections now, ways that we maybe took for granted before, that we can come into this space. And when I saw those images on the news of a small group gathered in a bunker in Ukraine, I thought, what a beautiful thing it is for us to have this freedom tonight, to be in this space. And for both kinds of communities to know the presence of God fully with us wherever we are. A couple of months into the pandemic, I was on a public transit bus in Buffalo, headed to a food pantry. And the bus kind of began to fill with lament and anxiety, that palpable kind that just takes up the space. And there was a man on the bus who said, "Why isn't God taking care of this?" And we all knew what this was because we were frustrated with the masks and the distancing and the fears and all that we were trying to hold together, and places being closed down, and people were talking about having trouble finding food. And I was trying to form a response to that that would be appropriate for a clergy person to say. And a woman across the aisle from me spoke up first, and she said, "He is. He's right here with us. God is on the bus." Indeed, a reminder that in all the communities we find ourselves in, God is there traveling with us. As we savor tonight being in this space and being together, today's gospel would seem to have a different kind of message, almost admonishing us for gathering at all. These signs that we practice on this holy day, this sacred time and space of worship, the visible signs of the ashes. But there's one thing that we know about that community that Matthew was speaking to and about, and that is the perspective that they were doing what they were meant to do. A perspective that the praying and the giving and the fasting and the repentance and all those things were regular practices. They were regular practices for followers of Jesus, and the admonishment was in making it a rare thing. The admonishment seems to come for people who made a big deal out of it because they only did it once in a while. What Matthew knew was those practices were what helped strengthen a community and remind one another day after day that God is present with us. Nothing over the top, nothing out of the ordinary, just regularly engaging in common prayer, regularly engaging in those practices that we do as a community whenever we're able, however we're able to do it. To keep finding our way home, and if not home, to God, to realize that God is there traveling with us. And perhaps most especially when all we seem to have known is changing before us, to know that God is there. In the early church, from the time of the first Christians, the gathered community has been a significant and sacred vessel, a vessel for God's transformative love. It's not to say that God's love doesn't enter in other ways, in other places, but the community of followers has been that outward and visible sign for the world that God is present. Because we come together and uphold these practices of prayer. We make this witness together that we know that God is wherever we are. And so we adapt to being the church, to know that that holy power is present, even if we can't be in a space like this, even if we can't all be together. That holy power of God is present beyond each of us as individuals, beyond this place, that brings us together, that binds us together, and helps us hold a kind of sacred space for others. Lent, from the first centuries of the church, has been a particular time of intention for these practices, a time for us to renew our commitment to them. It's not so much about giving things up or taking on new practices as I think it is about coming together, to be a community, to hold space, and to say that we know God is with us, to help one another remember and to see God's presence in action, ever with us. Although there is a lot of emphasis that's been placed over the centuries about this Lenten season being a time to prepare people for baptism, for the rite of initiation in the church, that practice from those earliest church communities emphasize the role of the whole community engaging once again in that commitment to the practices that were good for the person who was coming into community for the first time. That we as a whole community can practice those things together to make a space for people who are coming in. It's been a particularly important time for people who have been separated from community for whatever reason, to know that they can come and be received in community as a sign of God's forgiveness for them, to experience in tangible ways a sense of restoration. And I think now more than ever, we recognize that we don't want anyone to be separated. We don't want anyone to feel a sense of separation from God or God's beloved community. It's what we do. It's who we are. It's what it means to be in communion. And sometimes we lose our way. I think more often than not, we lose our way because we forget our worth in God's eyes. We forget the belovedness that God has named in us. We forget the power of a community to be a dwelling place for God. And so to help us remember, we engage in this season of Lent. We embark tonight on this pilgrimage together. And so I send us on our way with a kind of blessing at this time as we will approach for the imposition of ashes, a reminder of our mortality and a reminder of the love that God gives us that is eternal. This blessing in the form of poetry from Jan Richardson, from The Blessing of the Dust. Do you not know what the Holy One can do with dust? This is the day we freely say we are scorched. This is the hour we are marked by what has made it through the burning. This is the moment we ask for the blessing that lives within the ancient ashes, that makes its home inside the soil of this sacred earth. So let us be marked, not for sorrow, and let us be marked not for shame. Let us be marked not for false humility or for thinking we are less than we are, but for claiming what God can do within the dust, within the dirt, within the stuff of which the world is made.